Hey, Honors Bio, it's me, Mrs. Willis, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the basics of genetics and just provide you a brief introduction in what heredity is and some of the key vocabulary that you're going to be hearing through our genetics unit. Remember, our essential question for this unit is why do we sometimes look like our siblings, and then why do we sometimes not look like our siblings? So we're going to be discussing all this through a genetics lens. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is pretty much a definition, right? In case you're wondering what genetics is, or if you're a geneticist, what are you studying? Well, you're really studying the patterns of heredity and how things are passed on from one generation to the next. Now, way back in the day, they did not know, scientists did not know how heredity works. They could not explain the mechanism. They did, however, note that something was passed on from generation to generation and that influenced the appearance and the behavior of the offspring. Now we know that thing that's passed on to be DNA or RNA, so some sort of genetic information that is the basis for heredity. A word that you're going to be hearing a lot about is the word trait. We're going to hear it over and over in this genetics unit. A trait is a characteristic that the organism possesses, and we now know that traits are coded for by sections of DNA that we call genes. And so you have sequences of DNA that will code for the traits that you express. So looking at this monkey here, you can see there's a variety of traits that you can observe from this monkey. So it has 2 white ears, 2 eyes, a black chin, golden fur, 4 limbs. And all of these were coded for by the numerous sections of DNA that you possess in your chromosomes, and that will code for those traits that you express. Genes will control those traits. So sequences of DNA, and remember there are 4 base pairs for DNA, A, T, C, G. Remember we talked about apple tree and car garage. So adenine always goes with thymine and cytosine goes with guanine. So those sequences of A's and T's and C's and G's, they will code for a trait. And usually organisms will have 2 or more versions of that trait. And we call those versions alleles. So for example, a trait may be hair color, right? So a gene, you have genes for hair color. But the alleles could be red hair, blonde hair, black hair, brown hair, right? Those are all the different versions of that trait, and we call those alleles. And again, these are 2 words that you're going to be hearing a lot of in our genetics unit. So a gene is a sequence of DNA that codes for a trait, and there are different versions of those genes that we call alleles. Now, these different versions that we call alleles, they can take on one of 2 characteristics. Number 1, they can be dominant, or 2, they can be recessive. If you inherit a dominant allele from one of your parents, that allele will be expressed in your physical appearance. And we call that your phenotype. That's how I remember it. Phenotype is your physical characteristics. If you inherit a recessive allele from a parent, you will only express or show those recessive alleles if you get another recessive allele from the other parent. If at any time you inherit a dominant allele from either parent, that dominant allele is going to show up. However, if you don't inherit a dominant from either parent, you inherit a recessive allele, a recessive version from the other parent, and they come together to make you, then you will express the recessive. This is called the principle of dominance, and it was described by a very famous geneticist, kind of pretty much the father of genetics, named Gregor Mendel, and we will talk about him in a second. But let me just repeat, so the alleles, those are the different versions of your trait, right? Some of them can be dominant and some can be recessive. You inherit the alleles from your parents. If you inherit the dominant allele, that will show up in your phenotype. You will only express or show the recessive alleles if you didn't inherit any of the dominant alleles. For humans, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes that are in all of your cells, except for your gametes. You received 23 chromosomes from mom, and you received 23 chromosomes from dad, and they come together to make 23 pairs. Okay, each of these chromosomes are different sizes and lengths. And so when they pair up with their partner from the other parent, we call those homologous chromosomes. Remember, homo in Latin means same. So for example, chromosome 1 that you inherit from mom, if it pairs up with chromosome 1 from dad, those two are what we call homologous because they are the same chromosome. However, they do not always contain the same traits, right? Your mom looks different than your dad. And so those traits are lined up on those chromosomes, but like I was saying, they can have those different versions. So for example, mom may give you a blue allele and dad may give you the brown allele. They come together and whatever one is dominant is the one that will be expressed in you. The location of those traits on the chromosomes, that is what we call a locus. It's kind of easy to remember because locus does sound like location. How do we know all this genetics information and so forth? It comes down to the father of genetics, this guy right here. His name is Gregor Mendel, and he was an Austrian monk who liked to perform experiments in his monastery garden. So he would do lots of different experiments with plants. So you could say he was very fond of botany, the study of plants. Well, one plant that he experimented a lot with was the pea plant. So what he would do in his monastery's garden is he would take pea plants of different color flowers or different sizes, different seed pods, and he would cross them. So he would breed them. And he was very meticulous in his observations. He would count how many of the offspring came out to have purple flowers and how many of the offspring came out to have white flowers. And he started noticing some patterns with his crosses, with his breeding. And from that, he was able to infer that there was definitely patterns of inheritance that happened when you mated these flowers. He started seeing some definite predictable ratios that came up. And from that, again, he did infer that there was something being passed on from parent to offspring. But again, he didn't really know what it was. He just called it a heritable unit. When he was doing his breeding, he gave the generations specific names. So the first P generation, P stood for parental. So these were the parents that started the mating or the breeding in his crosses. That first generation was called the F1 generation, and the F actually stands for filial. It doesn't stand for first generation. And then, of course, when he crossed the F1, or sometimes he would have them self-pollinate, that would be called the F2 generation, the filial to the second generation. So keep that in mind. We're going to be doing Punnett scores later. You're going to want to become very comfortable using this terminology. So P stands for the parent, F1 is the first generation, and F2 is the second generation. And from his experimenting, he did notice that certain ratios and patterns came up in each of these generations. A second law that Mendel helped create is called the law of segregation. So segregation means to separate, right? We've heard this before. If you're a male, you are going to make sperm, and if you're a female, you're going to make eggs. When you go to make your gametes, as they're called, the alleles that you inherited from mom and dad, remember you have one of each, like you see here in this picture, big Y, little y, that's what's representing them. They go and they split up. they segregate into those different gametes. And that is what we call the law of segregation. So for example, if you're looking at this picture, if you inherited big Y from mom and little y from dad, when you go to make your gametes, the big Y is going to separate from the little y, and it's going to go into one of the gametes, and the little y is going to go into the other. They don't stay connected. Now, maybe you remember from middle school, sometimes mistakes do happen where one gamete inherits both of the alleles. But for the most part, what happens is they separate, they segregate. The last law that Mendel helped create is called the law of independent assortment. And you can kind of figure out what it means just by looking at the name, right? Independent assortment. So the alleles, the different versions of those traits, they're going to separate independently of one another when you go to make your gametes. So for example, I like kind of using this example. Okay, so you all probably know there are genes for hair color and eye color, right? And they're different. They're different traits. They're coded for by different sections of DNA. So when you go to make your eggs or sperm, say you do have brown hair and brown eyes, okay, it doesn't mean that all of the offspring are going to have brown hair, brown eyes. When you go to make those gametes, the traits separate independently of one another, meaning they're not linked together, and you won't inherit one just because you got the other. Now, later on, you are going to again note that there are exceptions to this rule, and one of those is what's called gene linkage. Scientists have found that yes, some traits are linked. If you get one, you're going to get the other trait. But that, for the most part, is not the case here. So again, just remember, you have all these different traits. Just because you get one type of trait doesn't mean you're going to get another. For the most part, they are not linked. They separate and they assort independently of one another. All right, so that concludes our little basics of genetics, and let's get on to our next activity.